Well, hello. So glad you're joining us in on a new series that we are going to be going through here at the West Oaks Church of Christ. We've been going through this time of pandemic, through our isolation period. We've been going through video devotional series that have been looking at different aspects, different parts of the Bible. We got a chance to look at the fruits of the Spirit, how we can apply it to our current predicament. We've just finished up a study on Psalm 119 as well. And so now we're going to start a new study over the next couple of weeks, and we're going to go back into the New Testament. We just got to look at some wisdom literature of the Old Testament, and now we're going to take a look at the New Testament. One of the things that, as I was considering things to look at, things to go into, one of the suggestions that was made to me that I thought was a really good one was looking at the miracles of Jesus. This is one of those studies that I think sometimes can get lost in the fact that there's so much occurring in the Gospels. There's so many different things going on. But the miracle stories really tell us a lot about Jesus, and they really set up a huge portion of his ministry. And one of the things that I think studying the miracles of Christ can do is they can help us to understand his ministry, but they can also, more importantly, help us to understand in a better light his crucifixion. Ultimately, the gospel accounts, as one writer put it, they're extended passion narratives with long introductions. Everything about the Gospels ultimately centers on the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross. And all of the miracles serve as signs and confirmations pointing towards that reality. So, by studying through the miracles of Jesus, we really get a good glimpse into what the gospel message is all about, and they help us to better understand what's going on in the crucifixion accounts. There are a good number of miracles in the four Gospels. Many of them are recorded in multiple places. Some of them are only recorded in one Gospel. And so we are, at the outset, kind of facing a couple of challenges here. The first is that the miracles are all part of narratives. Matthew is going to use these narratives in some different ways than Mark or Luke, and especially John will. Each of these authors is approaching the gospel from a different perspective and ultimately for different purposes as well. While they're all written for people to believe, they're all written to tell the story of Jesus. They're written to different audiences. They're written at different times of the growth of the church. And so they're utilizing these same stories to make different points. And so we're going to kind of try to explain that in some cases. We're going to kind of help to understand why there may occasionally be differences in one gospel's telling of a story than another. The first one, though, that we're going to look at is kind of easy because it's only told in one gospel, and that's going to be the Gospel of John. So if you want to, go ahead and turn over to John chapter 2, and we're going to look at the very first miracle in Jesus' ministry. And that's going to be the miracle at the wedding of Cana. And this actually serves as a really cool introduction for a couple of reasons. The first being is that this is a really odd miracle for Jesus to start with. When we often think of miracles, probably the first thing that comes to mind is healing miracles, the healing of the blind, the healing of the paralyzed, the healing of the mute, the casting out of demons, feeding large groups of people, great signs of God's power. And it would be very odd for us, if we're reading through this the first time, we might be thinking, why is the first miracle of Jesus providing entertainment at a party? It'd be very easy for people, and many skeptics have made the case, that this is a very odd start to the ministry of the Messiah, the one who has come to save Jesus. He's making a bunch of wine for people that it doesn't really enhance their lives. It doesn't really change who they are. It saves the hosts of the party some embarrassment, but there's no long-lasting effect of this. And this is an important thing to understand about miracles, is that miracles are never just about what's happening. The miracles are never just about healing. They're never just about casting out demons. They're never just about making wine. There are deep spiritual truths that are going on in these miracles. And the miracles that are preserved for us are preserved specifically to make these points. And so John in particular is very careful about the miracles that he uses. He only actually records 7 of them in his gospel, and each one of them makes a very profound point. So let's go ahead and dive into the narrative, and we're going to see exactly what's going on here. In John chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, "On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Both Jesus and his disciples were invited to the wedding. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, 'They have no wine.' And Jesus said to her, 'Woman, what does that have to do with us? My hour has not yet come.' His mother said to the servants, 'Whatever he says to you, do it.' Now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification, containing 20 or 30 gallons each. Jesus said to them, "Fill the water pots with water." So they filled them up to the brim. He said to them, "Draw out now and take it to the head waiter." So they took it to him. When the head waiter tasted the water, which had become wine, and did not know where it had come from, although the servants who had drawn the water knew, the head waiter called to the bridegroom and said to him, "Every man serves the good wine first, and when the people have drunk freely, then he serves the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine until now." This beginning of his signs Jesus did in Cana of Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After that, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. So John wants us to understand, he makes it very clear in verse 11, that this miracle was significant. He says it manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. Now, we could explain this away as just, this is an unprecedented thing. Nobody turns water to wine. And certainly this is a demonstration of the power of God. There's no way to explain how water becomes not just any wine, but good wine. And the only way that you get good wine is if it is aged properly. It has to go through certain processes. It's very carefully cultivated. It's typically bottled and stored for sometimes even up to years before it's sampled and considered to be a good wine. So certainly this is demonstrative of God's power and of Jesus' power over the natural world. But there's something very significant going on with this. Notice what Jesus' mother, what Mary says to him, "They have no wine." Now, one of the things that we have to understand about New Testament miracles is that the New Testament is based off an idea that you understand the Old Testament. You understand the symbols that are used in the Old Testament. You're familiar with the references. And sometimes we, as modern readers, might not have that familiarity with the Old Testament, which, by the way, is why it's so important to be familiar with the Old Testament. If we're not studying it, we're not seeing the full picture of what's going on here. And so I want to look at 2 particular references real quick. Keep your marker there in John chapter 2. But there's 2 really crucial references we want to understand that gives us a glimpse of how the Old Testament uses the portrayal of wine in particular. We tend to have very modernized perceptions of wine, and we tend to think wine, we think bad. And certainly wine is portrayed as a danger to people, but wine actually has a little bit more of a complex perspective in the Old Testament. If you look over at Psalm 104 and verse 15, the psalmist says, we'll actually read in verse 14. He said, "He causes the grass to grow for the cattle and vegetation for the labor of man, so that he may bring forth food from the earth and wine which makes man's heart glad, so that he may make his face glisten with oil and food which sustains men's heart." Wine is portrayed as a blessing in the Old Testament. It's something that you have to be careful about. It's something that you can very easily overindulge in. Wine can make you very foolish. But wine is a gift from God to man. And even from just a cultural perspective, we can understand this. Remember, 2,000 years ago, they don't have water filtration systems. They don't have some of the fancy things that we have to purify water. And so wine and alcoholic beverages were the most common drink because that would kind of purify, and you wouldn't have some of the gross bacteria that would grow in there. And so wine is portrayed in the Old Testament as a gift from God to man. So that's an important point to make. And then the other one, turn over to the prophet Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 63, there's another really important Old Testament reference to wine that we want to fully understand. And so in Isaiah chapter 63, in verse 2, Isaiah says, "Why is your apparel red, and your garments like the one who treads in the winepress? I have trodden the wine trough alone, and from the peoples there was no man with me. I also trod them in my anger and trampled them in my wrath, and their lifeblood is sprinkled on my garments, and I stained all my raiment. For the day of vengeance was in my heart, and my year of redemption has come." So wine is not just an image of God's gift, it's also an image of God's wrath. And when you hear the statement, the idea of treading the fierce wrath of God, that comes from this imagery. The way that wine was made in this time period, again, you don't have the fancy mechanization, is that literally you dump all the grapes into kind of this stone pit, and you would walk around and you would use your feet to squish the grapes, and the juice would then flow out of a trough that you would then be able to utilize the liquid. And so this imagery of a winepress of God, of the fierce wrath of God, these images are being used in mind when we read John chapter 2. Notice what Jesus uses to transform the water in the wine. That is specifically water that was used for the purification, 20 or 30 gallons each in these waters. So this water, this is the stuff that was used not only for cleansing different things, but it was also used for these ceremonials, washings of hands, these washings before you were able to be clean. And so these water pots represent this entire Mosaic system of purification, the idea of cleanliness, of uncleanliness. And so they are a marker of the current system. But what Mary's mother says, or what Jesus' mother Mary says, is that they have no wine. They don't have the wine that they need. They don't have the wine that is God's gift to man. They have the water. They have this water of purification, but that doesn't fit the need of what the people need right now. And this might seem like a very odd miracle. What is the big deal if, this people don't have wine? And you kind of wouldn't think that that's what Jesus is saying. He says, what does this have to do with us? My hour has not yet come. And so Jesus makes it very clear, I'm not a peddler of magician tricks. I don't just do things for the sake of them. They're related to my time, that hour, that crucifixion that we're talking about. But Jesus goes along with this, which, as a side note, is a really cool reflection on how much he loves his mother, how much he appreciates and respects his mother. That's a cool side note. But so this miracle has to do with his crucifixion. And so he takes this water that comes from the pots that is for purification. It's representative of this old law system. And he transforms it into wine. And not just any wine, not just grape juice water. It is good wine. It is the best wine. And so he has taken this water and he has transformed it into the wine that he himself will tread. It's an image of what's going to happen, that Jesus is going to take this Old Testament system and through his own blood that Isaiah is talking about being shed, that's what's going to cleanse the people. No longer are they going to be cleansed through this old law system. They're going to be cleansed through his blood. And so that's why John is preserving this miracle for us. It's not just a fancy party trick that Jesus can do, that he can transform water to wine. It's that it is showing what the purpose of Jesus coming down is. He is God's gift to man. He is God's provision of wine for man. And this is the treading of God's wrath that's going to occur. That's what's going to be fulfilled upon the cross, is that the wrath of God, the punishment that would come upon those who are sinners, it is instead being borne by Jesus. He is instead going to take upon himself the wrath that would be due us. So I hope this gives you kind of an idea and a glimpse into what we're going to be talking about with the miracles. They're much more than just cool demonstration of God's power. There's deep, intensive things going on here. There's deep spiritual truths that are being conveyed by these things. And so this kind of gives you an idea of what we're going to be talking about with Jesus's miracles. And we've got a whole bunch of them. I think grand total we got about 28 videos we're going to make. There's a total of about 37 miracles. Some of these we're going to kind of combine into videos, looking sections with them. But there's a lot to unpack in this series. So I hope that encourages you. I hope that kind of gives you a little bit of a taste of what we're going to be doing and how the Gospels so beautifully use Jesus's miracles to prove who he is, to prove what his mission was, and to prove what he has accomplished for his people. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. We pray that whatever the situation is over the next couple of weeks, we pray that it continues to be to God's glory, that we ultimately get the chance to be around one another as soon as possible. We continue to love you. We continue to pray for you guys. And we cannot wait for things to get back, at least somewhat, close to normal. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.